The conference room on the 42nd floor had floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the entire city. 23 executives sat around a mahogany table worth more than most people's houses. Everyone wore suits that cost thousands of dollars. Lawyers had flown in from 3 different states. The contract sat in the middle of the table, 247 pages thick, ready to be signed. One signature would change everything. One signature would make some people very rich and destroy the lives of thousands of others who would never even know what hit them. The CEO reached for his pen. His hand was steady. He had done this 100 times before. But then, the door opened. Nobody had knocked. Nobody was expected. The room went silent. A black woman in a janitor's uniform stood in the doorway, holding a mop in one hand and a bucket in the other. She was not supposed to be there. She was supposed to be invisible, the way she had been invisible for the past 11 years while she cleaned their offices, emptied their trash, and listened to everything they said when they thought nobody was paying attention. What she did next would expose secrets that powerful people had spent millions trying to hide. It would save lives. It would destroy careers. It would prove that sometimes the most important person in the room is the one everyone refuses to see. And it would start with just 4 words that cut through the silence like a knife: hold off on that contract. Margaret Hayes had been pushing a cleaning cart through the halls of Titanium Global Industries for 11 years, 2 months, and 16 days. Not that anyone had ever asked. Not that anyone ever would. To the executives who rushed past her in their expensive shoes, she was part of the furniture. Another fixture in the building, as permanent and as invisible as the marble columns in the lobby. She was 53 years old, though most people would have guessed older. The work aged you. Kneeling on hard floors, breathing in chemical fumes, working the night shift while the rest of the world slept. Her hands were rough and scarred from years of scrubbing. Her back ached every morning when she woke up. But she never complained. She needed this job. Her daughter was in her 2nd year of community college. Her mother was in a nursing home that cost more each month than Margaret made in 6 weeks. There was no room for complaining in her life. There was barely room for breathing. The night cleaning crew started at 8 in the evening and worked until 4 in the morning. Margaret liked the quiet. She liked being alone with her thoughts. She liked the rhythm of the work. Vacuum the carpets, empty the trash cans, wipe down the desks, clean the bathrooms, mop the floors. Every night the same routine. Every night the same invisible presence moving through spaces that belonged to other people during the day. But Margaret was not stupid. She had graduated high school with honors. She had taken college classes before her daughter was born, before her husband left, before life got complicated and expensive and impossible. She read books. She paid attention. And over 11 years of cleaning offices, she had learned something important. People talk when they think nobody is listening. They leave documents on their desks when they think nobody can read. They have conversations on speakerphone when they assume the cleaning lady does not understand business terms. They were wrong on all counts. Margaret understood more than they could imagine. She had taught herself about corporate law by reading the documents she found. She had learned about financial structures by listening to late-night conference calls. She knew which executives were honest and which ones were snakes. She knew who was sleeping with whom. She knew which departments were failing. She knew where the bodies were buried, so to speak. And for 11 years, she had kept every secret locked tight inside her head because that was not her world. Those were not her problems. She was just there to clean. Until tonight. Until she heard them talking about the Riverside Project. Until she realized that staying silent was no longer an option. The Riverside Project had been mentioned in hushed tones for almost 8 months. Margaret first heard about it while cleaning the office of Robert Shun, the chief financial officer. He had been on the phone with someone, his voice low and careful. She was emptying his trash can, practically invisible as always, when she caught fragments of the conversation. The numbers don't add up, but if we structure it correctly, nobody will notice until it's too late. By then, we'll have already moved the assets offshore. The people in Riverside won't know what hit them. At first, Margaret did not think much about it. Corporate people always talked about money and assets and restructuring. It was their language, their world. But the name Riverside stuck in her head because that was where her mother's nursing home was located. That was where her daughter went to community college. That was where Margaret herself had grown up in a small house on Maple Street that her parents had bought in 1972. Over the following months, she heard more small pieces of a larger puzzle. Late one night, while cleaning the executive conference room, she found a folder left open on the table. The cover page read, Riverside Redevelopment Initiative, Confidential. She should have just cleaned around it. She should have ignored it. But something made her stop. Something made her read. The document outlined a plan to buy up property in Riverside through shell companies. The area was mostly low-income housing, small businesses, and community facilities. The document called these underutilized assets. Margaret knew the real translation. Poor people, black and brown families who had lived there for generations. Her people, her community. The plan was to buy the properties cheap by convincing the city that the area was blighted and dangerous. Once they owned enough land, they would push through a rezoning initiative. Then, they would develop luxury condos and high-end retail spaces. The current residents would be pushed out, displaced, erased. But that was not even the worst part. The worst part was buried in the financial projections on page 47. Titanium Global had no intention of actually developing the area properly. They were going to use the Riverside project as a tax shelter and a money laundering scheme. They would inflate the development costs on paper, claim massive losses, and use those losses to offset taxes on their profitable ventures in other cities. They would start construction, do the bare minimum, and then abandon the project, leaving Riverside worse than they found it. Contaminated, broken, worthless. Margaret had carefully put the folder back exactly where she found it. She finished cleaning the room. She went home that night and could not sleep. She kept seeing her mother's nursing home on the list of properties slated for acquisition. She kept thinking about the families who would lose their homes. She kept thinking about her daughter's college, which would lose funding once the area was declared economically unviable. She told herself it was not her business. She was just a janitor. Who would listen to her? What could she possibly do? She had tried to forget about it. She had tried to focus on her work. But then, she kept finding more pieces of the puzzle. A memo here, an email there, phone conversations that happened while she mopped floors and wiped down windows. She learned that the city council was involved. 3 council members were receiving payments disguised as consulting fees. She learned that the environmental impact reports were being falsified. The construction company that Titanium Global planned to use had a history of cutting corners and using toxic materials. She learned that the community health center in Riverside, which provided free care to thousands of people, was going to be demolished in the first phase of the project. She learned that the whole thing was scheduled to start in 2 weeks. The final contract was being signed tonight. Once those signatures were on paper, it would be too late to stop. The machinery would start moving. The lawyers were already prepared. The shell companies were already established. The city officials were already bought and paid for. Riverside would be destroyed, and nobody would be able to prove that Titanium Global had done anything illegal because everything had been carefully structured to look legitimate on the surface. Margaret had spent the last week trying to figure out what to do. She had thought about going to the police, but what would she tell them? She had no proof. The documents she had seen were confidential. She was not supposed to have read them. She could lose her job. She could be sued. She could be arrested for industrial espionage or theft of proprietary information. Her family depended on her income. She could not afford to take that risk. She had thought about going to the newspaper, but would they believe a janitor over a multi-billion-dollar corporation? Would they even listen to her? And even if they did, by the time they investigated and published anything, the contract would already be signed. The damage would already be done. She had thought about doing nothing, about just letting it happen, about protecting herself and her family and staying invisible like she had always been. But every time she closed her eyes, she saw the faces of the people who lived in Riverside, her neighbors, her friends, the nurse who took care of her mother, the professor who was helping her daughter study engineering, the kid who worked at the grocery store and always asked about her day. Real people with real lives who had no idea what was coming for them. Tonight was the night of the final contract signing. Margaret knew because she had seen it on the executive calendar. 8 o'clock in the evening. Conference room on the 42nd floor. All the major players would be there. The CEO, the CFO, the lawyers, the investors, the city officials who were in on the deal. They had scheduled it for after business hours, so there would be fewer people in the building. Fewer witnesses. More privacy. Margaret's shift started at 8. She was not scheduled to clean the 42nd floor until after midnight. But she made a decision. She finished her regular duties on the lower floors as quickly as she could. She loaded her cart with supplies. She took the service elevator up to the executive level. Her heart was pounding. Her hands were shaking. She had no plan. She had no idea what she was going to do. She just knew she could not let this happen without at least trying to stop it. She could hear voices as she approached the conference room. Male voices mostly. Confident. Self-assured. The voices of people who were used to getting everything they wanted. She stood outside the door for a long moment, her hand on the handle of her mop. She could still turn around. She could still go back to being invisible. She could still protect herself. But then she thought about her mother, about her daughter, about Riverside, about all the people who had no voice and no power and no way to fight back against corporations with armies of lawyers and unlimited money. She thought about how nobody had ever stood up for people like her, how nobody had ever protected her community, how the system was designed to keep people like her in their place, silent and powerless and afraid. She opened the door. She did not knock. She just opened it and walked in with her mop and her bucket. The room went silent. 23 faces turned to look at her. 23 pairs of eyes registered surprise, then annoyance, then dismissal. She was just the cleaning lady. An interruption. A minor inconvenience. Someone would tell her to come back later, and she would disappear, and they would forget she had ever been there. The CEO was sitting at the head of the table. Richard Morrison, 62 years old. Silver hair. Expensive suit. Cold eyes. He looked at her the way you might look at a stray dog that had wandered into your house. "We're in the middle of something important," he said. His voice was clipped. Irritated. "You need to come back later." Margaret stood in the doorway. She looked at the contract in the middle of the table. She looked at the pens lined up next to it. She looked at all those powerful people in their expensive clothes. And she opened her mouth and said the 4 words she had been practicing in her head for the last 3 hours. Hold off on that contract. The silence that followed was absolute. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. It was as if the entire room had frozen in place. Then, Richard Morrison laughed. It was not a friendly laugh. It was the laugh of someone who thought he had just heard the most absurd thing imaginable. "Excuse me," he said. Margaret stepped into the room. She left her mop and bucket by the door. She walked toward the table. Every instinct in her body was screaming at her to run, to apologize, to back down. But she kept walking. She kept her eyes on Richard Morrison. "I said hold off on that contract," she repeated. Her voice was stronger this time. "Steadier. You don't want to sign it." Robert Chun, the CFO, stood up. His face was red. "This is completely inappropriate. Security needs to remove this woman immediately." But Richard Morrison held up his hand. He was looking at Margaret with something like curiosity now, like she was an interesting specimen under a microscope. "No, wait," he said. "I want to hear this. Why exactly would we want to hold off on this contract? Please enlighten us." He was mocking her. They all were. She could hear the barely suppressed laughter around the table. But Margaret had not come this far to back down now. She took a deep breath. "Because I know what you're planning to do with Riverside," she said. "I know about the shell companies. I know about the falsified environmental reports. I know about the payments to the city council members. I know about the tax shelter scheme. I know about all of it." The laughter stopped. The atmosphere in the room changed instantly. It went from amused condescension to something darker, something dangerous. Richard Morrison's eyes narrowed. "I have no idea what you're talking about," he said. His voice was very quiet, very controlled. "But you're making some very serious accusations. Accusations that could get you sued for slander. Accusations that could destroy your life. I suggest you leave right now before you say something you'll regret." Margaret felt her courage starting to waver. These people had more money and power than she could comprehend. They could crush her like a bug. But she thought about Riverside. She thought about her mother. She thought about her daughter. She stood her ground. "I have proof," she said. It was a lie. She had no proof that she could actually present. All the documents she had seen belonged to the company. She had no legal right to them. But she said it anyway, hoping it would buy her time, hoping it would make them pause. "Proof," Richard Morrison repeated. "What kind of proof?" "Documents," Margaret said. Emails, memos, financial records. Everything you've been planning for the Riverside project. Everything you think nobody knows about. I've been cleaning these offices for 11 years. I've seen things. I've heard things. I've kept copies. Another lie. She had kept no copies. But the executives did not know that. She watched their faces. She saw the calculations happening behind their eyes. She saw the doubt creeping in. What if she was telling the truth? What if there was a paper trail they had missed? What if this janitor they had ignored for over a decade actually had evidence that could destroy them? One of the lawyers leaned over and whispered something to Richard Morrison. Another lawyer pulled out his phone and started typing furiously. The city officials at the table looked nervous. One of them was sweating. "This is absurd," Robertson said. But his voice lacked conviction now. He looked rattled. Richard Morrison stared at Margaret for a long moment. She stared back. She refused to look away. She refused to show fear, even though she was terrified. Finally, he spoke. "Everyone out," he said. "Meeting postponed. We'll reconvene tomorrow." There was immediate chaos. Voices raised in protest. Questions shouted across the table. But Richard Morrison ignored them all. He kept his eyes on Margaret. "Everyone out except her," he said, pointing at Margaret. "I want to talk to our friend here privately." The room emptied slowly. People gathered their papers and their laptops. They threw hostile glances at Margaret as they filed past. The lawyers looked particularly angry. The city officials looked scared. Within 5 minutes, the room was empty except for Margaret and Richard Morrison. He gestured to a chair. "Sit down," he said. It was not a request. Margaret sat. Her legs were shaking so badly, she was not sure she could have kept standing anyway. Richard Morrison sat across from her. He folded his hands on the table. He looked at her like he was trying to solve a complicated problem. "What's your name?" he asked. "Margaret Hayes." "How long have you worked here, Margaret?" 11 years. He nodded slowly. 11 years. "And in all that time, nobody has noticed how observant you are. Nobody has paid any attention to you at all. That's our mistake. My mistake. I should have known better. The invisible ones are always the most dangerous." Margaret said nothing. She waited. "Here's the situation," Richard Morrison continued. "You've put me in a difficult position. You've disrupted a very important business deal. You've made some very serious allegations. Now I have lawyers and investors and city officials who are all wondering what you know and what you might do with that information. They're scared. Scared people do unpredictable things. So I need to know exactly what we're dealing with here." "I told you," Margaret said. "I know about the Riverside project. I know what you're really planning. And I told you." "I have no idea what you're talking about," Richard Morrison said. "But let's say, hypothetically, that there was some kind of development project in the works. Let's say, hypothetically, that you had stumbled across some information about it. What exactly are you planning to do with this information?" Margaret had not thought that far ahead. She had been so focused on stopping the contract signing that she had not considered what would happen next. She improvised. "I want you to cancel the Riverside project," she said. "All of it. No development. No buyouts. No shell companies. Leave Riverside alone." Richard Morrison laughed again. But it was different this time. Not mocking. Almost respectful. "You're either very brave or very stupid," he said. "Probably both. Do you have any idea how much money has already been invested in this project? How many people have a stake in seeing it happen? You can't just snap your fingers and make it all go away." "Then I'll go public," Margaret said. "I'll tell the newspapers. I'll tell the police. I'll tell everyone." "With what evidence?" Richard Morrison asked. "You said you had proof, but we both know that's not true. You have nothing concrete. Nothing that would hold up in court. And even if you did, do you think the newspapers would believe you? Do you think the police would take your word over ours? You're a janitor, Margaret. I'm sorry to be blunt, but that's the reality. Nobody is going to listen to you. And if you try to make noise, we'll bury you. We'll sue you for theft of proprietary information. We'll get you fired. We'll make sure you never work again. We'll come after your family. Is that really what you want?" Margaret felt tears burning in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "So that's it," she said. "You're just going to do whatever you want. And there's nothing anyone can do to stop you?" "Welcome to the real world," Richard Morrison said. He stood up. "This conversation is over. Go back to your cleaning. Forget about the Riverside project. Forget about this whole night. If you're smart, you'll keep your mouth shut and keep your job." If you're not smart, you'll find out just how painful life can get when you cross people like me. He walked toward the door. He was dismissing her. Just like that. The conversation was over. She had failed. She had tried to be brave, tried to make a difference, and she had failed completely. But then, she remembered something. Something she had seen 3 weeks ago while cleaning Richard Morrison's office. A file labeled Personal, Confidential. She had glanced at it while emptying his trash. Inside had been documents related to his divorce. His wife was leaving him because she had found out about his affairs. But, more importantly, she had found out about his offshore accounts. Accounts where he had been hiding money from the IRS. Accounts that were definitely illegal. Margaret had not thought much about it at the time. It was not her business. But, now, desperate and cornered, she played her last card. The ones your wife found out about. I saw the documents in your office. I remember the account numbers. I remember the bank names. I remember everything. For the first time since she had entered the room, Richard Morrison looked genuinely afraid. You're bluffing, he said. But his voice shook. Am I? Margaret stood up. She walked toward him. She recited from memory 3 account numbers and 2 bank names. She watched his face go from pale to gray. How did you? He started to say. Margaret's mind was racing. She had not expected to get this far. She had expected to be thrown out, fired, maybe arrested. But here she was, standing in front of one of the most powerful men in the city, and he was asking her what she wanted. She had leverage, real leverage, but she had to use it carefully. One wrong word, and everything could fall apart. I want the Riverside project canceled, she said. Completely. No development. No property buyouts. No shell companies. You walk away from the whole thing. Richard Morrison shook his head. That's impossible. There are contracts already signed with investors. There are commitments made. I can't just cancel it. You can't, Margaret said. Or you won't. Both, he admitted. Even if I wanted to cancel it, which I don't, the other investors would never allow it. They would sue me. They would remove me as CEO. They would find out about your offshore accounts. Margaret interrupted. Because I'm pretty sure once the IRS starts investigating you, those investors are going to have bigger problems than a canceled development project. Once it comes out that the CEO of Titanium Global has been committing tax fraud, the whole company's stock will tank. Everyone will lose money, including your precious investors. Richard Morrison was silent. She could see him thinking, weighing his options, calculating the costs. She pressed her advantage. Here's what's going to happen, Margaret said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. Tomorrow morning, you're going to call an emergency meeting with your investors. You're going to tell them that the Riverside project has too many risks. Environmental risks, legal risks, whatever you need to say. You're going to convince them to walk away from it. You're good at convincing people, Mr. Morrison. That's how you got this job. So convince them. And if I do this, he asked, what happens to the information you have about my accounts? I keep it to myself, Margaret said. As long as Riverside stays safe. As long as the people who live there get to keep their homes, and their businesses, and their lives. You stay away from that community, and I stay quiet about what I know. That's the deal. Richard Morrison studied her face. You're not a stupid woman, he said. You could have asked for money. You could have blackmailed me for millions. You could have set yourself up for life. Why didn't you? Because I don't need millions, Margaret said. I just need to know that my community is safe. That my mother has a place to live. That my daughter can finish school. That the people I care about aren't going to be thrown out of their homes so rich people can make more money they don't need. For just a moment, something flickered across Richard Morrison's face. It might have been respect. It might have been shame. It was gone too quickly for Margaret to be sure. He walked to the window and looked out at the city below. You know what the ironic thing is? He said, not turning around. I grew up in a place like Riverside. Small house. Working-class family. My father was a mechanic. My mother cleaned houses. I swore I would never be poor again. I swore I would do whatever it took to climb to the top. And I did. But, somewhere along the way, I forgot what it was like. I forgot that the people I'm pushing out of places like Riverside are the same kind of people my parents were. The same kind of person I used to be. He turned back to face her. I'm not a good man, Margaret. I've done things I'm not proud of. I've hurt people. I've put profit over people more times than I can count. But, I'm not a monster. Or at least, I don't want to be. So I'll make you a deal. I'll cancel the Riverside project. I'll find a way to make it work with the investors. But, I need something from you. What? Margaret asked suspiciously. Time, he said. I need time to unwind this carefully. If I just suddenly cancel everything tomorrow, people will ask questions. They'll investigate. They might find out about our conversation. They might find out about you. And then you'll be in danger. These investors, some of them are not nice people. If they think you're the reason they lost money, they might come after you. So I need to do this slowly, carefully, in a way that doesn't raise suspicions. Margaret considered this. It made sense. But it could also be a trap. How much time? She asked. 6 months, he said. Give me 6 months to dismantle the project piece by piece. I'll start backing out of agreements. I'll cite problems with permits. I'll create delays. I'll gradually convince everyone that the project isn't viable. By the end of 6 months, it will be dead, and nobody will suspect that it had anything to do with you. 6 months is a long time, Margaret said. How do I know you'll actually do it? How do I know this isn't just a stalling tactic? Richard Morrison walked to his briefcase and pulled out a business card. He wrote something on the back and handed it to Margaret. That's my personal cell phone number. Not my assistant. Not my office. Me. You call that number once a week. Every week for the next 6 months. I'll give you updates on the progress. If at any point you think I'm not holding up my end of the deal, you can go public with everything you know. But I'm asking you to trust me. Just for 6 months. Margaret looked at the card. She looked at Richard Morrison. Every instinct told her not to trust him. He was a corporate executive. He had spent his whole career lying and manipulating people. But she also saw something in his eyes that she had not expected to see. He looked tired. He looked old. He looked like a man who was tired of being the villain. Okay, she said finally. 6 months. But if you double-cross me, I swear I will burn your whole life down. I believe you, he said. And he smiled. It was a sad smile. You know, in another life, you would have made a hell of a CEO. In another life, Margaret said, I wouldn't have had to fight people like you just to protect my home. She picked up her mop and bucket and walked out of the conference room. Her whole body was shaking. She could not believe what had just happened. She could not believe she had stood up to Richard Morrison and won. Or at least, she hoped she had won. Only time would tell. The next 6 months were the longest of Margaret's life. She called Richard Morrison's personal number every Thursday at 9 in the evening. Every week, he answered. Every week, he gave her updates. The first week, he told her he had started planting seeds of doubt with the major investors. The second week, he mentioned discovering supposed environmental complications. The third week, he said one of the shell companies had suddenly run into legal troubles. Margaret listened carefully to every word. She took notes. She verified what she could through the documents she continued to see in the offices she cleaned. And, slowly, she watched the Riverside project begin to fall apart. Investors started pulling out. City officials started backing away. The lawyers started finding problems with the contracts. But it was not smooth sailing. There were weeks when Margaret was sure Richard Morrison was lying to her. There were weeks when it seemed like the project was moving forward despite his promises. During those weeks, Margaret barely slept. She kept copies of the account numbers in 3 different safe places. She wrote down everything she knew in a detailed letter that she left with her pastor, with instructions to open it if anything happened to her. Her daughter noticed that something was different. Mom, are you okay? Jessica asked one Sunday afternoon. You seem stressed. More stressed than usual. Margaret wanted to tell her everything. She wanted to share the burden she had been carrying for months. But she could not. The fewer people who knew, the safer everyone would be. I'm fine, baby, she said. Just working a lot. Trying to save up some extra money. Her mother noticed too. During one of Margaret's visits to the nursing home, her mother grabbed her hand. Something's bothering you, she said. Her mother had dementia, but sometimes she had moments of clarity. You've got that look you used to get when you were little, and you'd done something brave and scary. Margaret smiled. Maybe I did, Mama. Maybe I did something brave. Good, her mother said. The world needs more brave people. Especially brave women. Especially brave Black women. We've always had to be the ones to stand up and fight. Nobody else is going to do it for us. At work, Margaret continued her routine. She cleaned offices. She emptied trash cans. She mopped floors. But now when she walked through the executive suites, she noticed that some people looked at her differently. Word had spread somehow that the Riverside project had been postponed indefinitely. Some executives suspected that there had been a leak. Some suspected corporate espionage. Nobody suspected the cleaning lady. Except for Robert Chen. The CFO had always been sharper than the others. One night, about 4 months into Margaret's arrangement with Richard Morrison, Robert Chen was working late. Margaret was cleaning his office when he suddenly spoke. "It was you, wasn't it?" he said. Margaret froze. She had her back to him. She was wiping down his desk. "Excuse me," she said, trying to keep her voice neutral. "The Riverside project," he said. "You're the reason it's falling apart. I don't know how, and I don't know why, but I know it was you. The timing is too coincidental. Right after you burst into that meeting, everything started going wrong." Margaret turned to face him. Robert Chun was leaning back in his chair, watching her with calculating eyes. She said nothing. She just waited. "I can't prove it," he continued. "And, honestly, I don't want to. That project was Morrison's baby, not mine. I went along with it because that's my job. But, between you and me, I'm not sorry to see it die. There was something dirty about the whole thing. Too many lawyers. Too many shell companies. Too many backroom deals. It was going to blow up in our faces eventually. You probably did us a favor." "I don't know what you're talking about," Margaret said carefully. Robert Chin smiled. "Of course you don't. You're just the cleaning lady. You don't notice anything. You don't hear anything. You're invisible. But, just between us invisible people, let me give you some advice. Morrison is better than most of the sharks in this building, but he's still a shark. Watch your back. And, whatever leverage you have over him, hold on to it. Because the day he doesn't need you anymore is the day you become a liability." He turned back to his computer, dismissing her. Margaret finished cleaning his office in silence. Her hands were shaking again. Robert Chin knew. Or at least he suspected. If he knew, how many others suspected? How long could she keep this secret? How long until someone decided she was too dangerous to leave alone? That night, she called Richard Morrison on his personal line. "We need to move faster," she said when he answered. "People are starting to figure it out." "I know," he said. "Chin came to me today. He didn't say anything directly, but I could tell he's suspicious. Don't worry. I'll handle it." "How?" Margaret demanded. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to finish this," Richard Morrison said. "The project is basically dead already. We're down to 2 investors, and I'm working on convincing them to cut their losses. Give me 2 more weeks. By the end of this month, the Riverside project will be officially canceled. Then, you can disappear back into your normal life, and nobody will ever connect you to any of this." 2 weeks, Margaret repeated. 2 weeks, he confirmed. "I promise." Margaret wanted to believe him. She needed to believe him. Because if he was lying, if this was all some elaborate trap, she had no backup plan. She had no escape route. She had bet everything on the hope that a corporate CEO could be trusted to keep his word. The next 2 weeks crawled by at an agonizing pace. Margaret jumped every time someone spoke to her at work. She checked over her shoulder constantly. She had nightmares about men in suits showing up at her apartment, or worse, showing up at her daughter's school or her mother's nursing home. But nothing happened. The building remained quiet. Her shift remained routine. And then, on a Thursday night 3 weeks before the 6-month deadline, Richard Morrison called her. "It's done," he said when she answered. "The Riverside project is officially canceled. I sent out a company-wide memo this afternoon, cited environmental concerns and permitting issues. The last 2 investors pulled out this morning. It's over." Margaret sat down heavily on her couch. She had not realized how much tension she had been carrying until it suddenly released. "It's really over?" she asked. "It's really over," he confirmed. "Riverside is safe. The properties that had been quietly purchased are being put back on the market at reasonable prices. The community center is not going to be demolished. The nursing homes are staying open. Everything you wanted, it's done." "Thank you," Margaret said. The words felt strange in her mouth. She had never imagined she would be thanking Richard Morrison for anything. "Don't thank me," he said. "You're the one who made this happen. You're the one who had the courage to walk into that room. I just stopped being a coward for a few months. That's all." There was a long pause. Then, Richard Morrison spoke again. "Margaret, can I ask you something?" "What?" "Why didn't you try to profit from this? You had real leverage. You could have asked for anything. Money. A better job. Stock options. Anything. Why did you only ask to save Riverside?" Margaret thought about how to answer. "Because Riverside isn't just a place," she said finally. "It's home. It's where my mother raised me. It's where I'm raising my daughter. It's where people look out for each other because nobody else is going to look out for us. You can't put a price on that. At least, I can't. Some things are more important than money. I used to know that, Richard Morrison said quietly. I used to believe that. Somewhere along the way, I forgot. Thank you for reminding me. Does this mean you're going to change your ways? Margaret asked. Become one of the good guys? He laughed. It was a bitter sound. Probably not. I'm too far down this road to turn back now. But maybe I'll be a little less ruthless. Maybe I'll think twice before the next project like Riverside comes across my desk. That's the best I can offer. I'll take it, Margaret said. We won't speak again, Richard Morrison said. Delete this number. Forget we ever had this conversation. Go back to being invisible. It's safer that way. I will, Margaret said. Goodbye, Mr. Morrison. Goodbye, Margaret. And, for what it's worth, you're the bravest person I've ever met. The line went dead. Margaret sat in her dark apartment, holding her phone. She felt exhausted, relieved, triumphant, terrified, all at once. She had done something impossible. She had beaten a system that was designed to crush people like her. She had saved her community. And nobody would ever know. That was the hardest part. She could never tell anyone what she had done. She could never share this victory. Her daughter would never know that her mother had stood up to corporate power and won. Her mother would never know that the nursing home she lived in was still standing because of Margaret. The neighbors in Riverside would never know that they had been saved from displacement by a woman who cleaned offices for a living. But Margaret knew. And somehow that was enough. The next few months passed quietly. Life returned to normal. Margaret went to work every night. She cleaned offices and mopped floors. She visited her mother on Sundays. She helped her daughter study for exams. The Riverside community continued to thrive, unaware of how close they had come to destruction. Margaret noticed small changes at Titanium Global. There was a new policy about corporate social responsibility. There was a new committee formed to review the ethical implications of major projects. She heard through overheard conversations that Richard Morrison had pushed for these changes, much to the surprise of the other executives. She also noticed that her paycheck had increased slightly. Nothing dramatic, just a small cost of living adjustment that applied to all the cleaning staff. It happened 3 months after the Riverside project was canceled. Margaret suspected it was Richard Morrison's doing, his way of saying thank you without drawing attention to her. One evening, about 8 months after that night in the conference room, Margaret was cleaning the executive floor when she saw Robert Chun leaving his office. He stopped when he saw her. Good evening, Margaret, he said. She nodded. Evening, Mr. Chun. He hesitated, then spoke quietly. I don't know what you did, and I don't want to know. But, whatever it was, a lot of people owe you a debt they'll never know about. Thank you. Before she could respond, he walked away. Margaret stood in the empty hallway, holding her cleaning supplies, and allowed herself a small smile. Some people had figured it out. Not everyone was as blind as they pretended to be. But the most unexpected moment came a year after the incident. Margaret was cleaning Richard Morrison's office one night when she noticed a photograph on his desk that had not been there before. It showed a group of people at a ribbon-cutting ceremony. She looked closer and recognized the location. It was in Riverside, the Community Health Center. There was a new sign, Morrison Family Health Center. Richard Morrison had donated money to expand the health center. He had put his family name on it. Margaret did not know how much he had given, but, judging from the size of the new building in the photograph, it was substantial. This was his atonement, his way of making amends. Margaret felt tears in her eyes. She quickly wiped them away and finished cleaning the office. Some people could change. Not everyone. Not most people. But some. Life went on. Seasons changed. Her daughter graduated from community college and got a scholarship to a 4-year university. Her mother's health declined slowly, but she was comfortable and well cared for in the nursing home. Margaret kept working her night shift, kept cleaning offices, kept being invisible. But she was not the same person she had been before that night. She walked a little taller. She spoke a little more freely. She had learned something important about power. It was not just about money or position or influence. Real power came from courage, from conviction, from the willingness to risk everything for what you believed in. And she had learned that even the most powerless person could change the world if they were brave enough to try. One night, almost 18 months after the confrontation, Margaret was training a new member of the cleaning crew, a young woman named Destiny, fresh out of high school, working to pay for classes at the community college. Destiny was nervous and overwhelmed by all the rules and procedures. "Don't worry," Margaret told her. "You'll get the hang of it. Just remember, we might be invisible to most people here, but that doesn't mean we don't matter. Keep your eyes open. Pay attention. You never know when you might see or hear something important. And if you ever do, if you ever learn something that could help people, don't be afraid to speak up, even if it's scary, especially if it's scary." Destiny looked at her curiously. "Has that ever happened to you?" Margaret smiled. "Once," she said. "Once I had to make a choice between staying safe and doing what was right. I chose what was right. It was the hardest thing I've ever done, but I'd do it again in a heartbeat." 2 years after the conference room confrontation, Margaret's life had settled into a comfortable routine that felt almost normal. Almost. Because every day she woke up knowing she had done something extraordinary, even if the world would never know about it. That secret lived inside her like a warm coal, sustaining her through the long nights and difficult shifts. Jessica had transferred to the university and was thriving in her engineering program. She called Margaret every Sunday to share stories about her professors and her projects and her dreams of one day designing sustainable buildings that would help communities like Riverside. Margaret listened with pride, never telling her daughter that she had already saved one community through her own kind of engineering. Her mother's condition had worsened, but the nursing home remained excellent. The Morrison Family Health Center had a new wing dedicated to dementia care, and her mother had been transferred there 6 months ago. The care was exceptional, far better than what Margaret could have afforded on her salary. She suspected Richard Morrison had quietly arranged for the costs to be covered, though nothing was ever said directly. Margaret still worked the night shift at Titanium Global, still pushed her cleaning cart through the marble hallways, still emptied trash cans and mopped floors. But something fundamental had changed in how she experienced the work. She no longer felt invisible. She felt like a secret agent, moving through the corporate world gathering intelligence, watching for the next time her unique position might allow her to make a difference. She had started paying attention to other companies too, not just Titanium Global. She listened to the janitors who worked in other buildings. She attended a monthly meeting of the cleaning staff union where workers from across the city shared stories and concerns. And what she heard troubled her. There was a pattern emerging. Several major corporations were planning similar projects to what Titanium Global had attempted with Riverside. Different neighborhoods, different cities, but the same basic structure. Shell companies, displacement of low-income communities, tax shelters disguised as development projects. It was happening everywhere, and nobody was stopping it because the people being hurt had no voice and no power. Margaret began to realize that saving Riverside had been just the beginning. The problem was bigger than one project. It was systemic, and she started to wonder if maybe, just maybe, she could do something about it. She started documenting what she heard. Nothing that could get her in trouble, just general observations. She created a notebook where she recorded the patterns she noticed. Which companies were targeting which neighborhoods? Which city officials seemed to be taking bribes? Which developers had histories of abandoning projects after extracting tax benefits? She kept the notebook hidden in her apartment, locked in a small safe she had purchased with her tax refund. One night, while cleaning the office of a new executive at Titanium Global, Margaret overheard a phone conversation that made her blood run cold. The executive, a woman named Patricia Simmons, was discussing a new project with someone. The target was a neighborhood called Westbrook, about 40 miles away. The strategy was identical to the Riverside project. Same shell companies, same false environmental reports, same displacement of vulnerable families. But this was not Titanium Global's project. Patricia was a consultant, and she was advising another company on how to structure the deal to avoid the kind of problems that had derailed Riverside. She was literally teaching other corporations how to be more careful, more secretive, more effective at destroying communities for profit. Margaret stood outside the office, her mop frozen in her hand, listening in horror. Patricia was talking about Riverside as a cautionary tale. "We need to make sure we don't have any leaks," she was saying. The Riverside thing fell apart because Morrison got cold feet at the last minute. Someone must have gotten to him. We need to make sure all our people are completely loyal and that there's no possibility of information getting out to the wrong hands. Margaret finished cleaning that floor in a daze. She went home that night and could not sleep. Westbrook was a community of mostly immigrant families. First-generation Americans working multiple jobs to build better lives for their children. She had driven through there once. It reminded her of Riverside 20 years ago, full of hope and struggle and dignity. And now some corporation was planning to destroy it. And they had learned from the Riverside experience to be more careful about it. Margaret had won one battle, but she had inadvertently taught the enemy how to fight smarter. She spent the next week wrestling with what to do. She could not confront another CEO. That trick would not work twice. Besides, she did not even know which corporation was behind the Westbrook project. Patricia Simmons was just a consultant. The real power was somewhere else, hidden behind layers of shell companies and legal structures. She thought about going to the press, but she had no concrete proof. Everything she had was circumstantial. Overheard conversations, observations, patterns. No smoking gun documents like she had found with the Riverside project. Any reporter would ask for evidence she could not provide. She thought about going to the police, but what law was being broken? Corporations were allowed to buy property. They were allowed to develop land. The corruption and fraud were carefully hidden behind legal facades. The police would not investigate based on the word of a janitor with no hard evidence. She felt helpless and frustrated. She had tasted victory once, and now she was faced with a problem too big for one person to solve. She needed help. But who could she trust? The answer came from an unexpected source. Robert Chun, the CFO who had suspected her involvement in stopping the Riverside project, approached her one evening as she was cleaning the executive floor. It was almost midnight. The building was nearly empty. "Margaret," he said, "do you have a moment to talk?" She was immediately wary. Robert Chun had always been polite to her, but he was still a corporate executive, still part of the system. "I'm working, Mr. Chun," she said carefully. "I know," he said, "but this is important. Please, just 5 minutes." She followed him into an empty conference room. He closed the door and turned to face her. He looked tired, older than she remembered. "I'm leaving Titanium Global," he said without preamble. "I gave my notice this morning. My last day is in 2 weeks. Margaret was surprised. "Why?" "Because I'm tired," he said. "Tired of being part of a machine that chews up people and spits out profits. I've spent 30 years in corporate finance. I've helped companies make billions of dollars. And for what? So executives can buy bigger yachts while families lose their homes? I can't do it anymore." He sat down heavily in one of the conference room chairs. "The Riverside thing changed me," he continued. "Watching that project fall apart, knowing that someone had stood up to Morrison and won, it made me realize how much of my career has been spent on the wrong side. I want to do something different. Something that matters." Margaret sat down across from him. "What does this have to do with me?" "I know it was you," Robertson said. "I figured it out months ago. I don't know exactly what you said to Morrison, but I know you're the reason Riverside was saved. And I want to help you." "Help me do what?" Margaret asked. "Whatever you're planning next," he said. "Because I know you. I've watched you for the past 2 years. You're not the type of person to save one community and then stop. You see the bigger picture. You know that Riverside was just one battle in a much larger war. So what's next?" Margaret studied his face. Could she trust him? He was still a corporate insider. Still one of them. But he also seemed genuine. Broken even. Like a man who had finally realized the cost of the life he had been living. "There's another project," she said slowly. "A place called Westbrook. Another community about to be destroyed. But I don't know how to stop it. I don't have leverage this time. I don't even know which company is behind it." Robertson nodded. "Patricia Simmons is consulting on it. I know because she tried to recruit me before I decided to quit. The company is called Meridian Development Group. They're even worse than Titanium Global. They specialize in exactly this kind of predatory development. They've destroyed dozens of communities over the past decade. How do we stop them?" Margaret asked. "We don't," Robertson said. "Not alone. We need to build something bigger. A network of people who can fight back against these kinds of projects. Whistleblowers, activists, lawyers, journalists, people on the inside who are tired of being part of the problem. I want to start an organization, and I want you to help me run it. Margaret stared at him. Me? I'm a janitor. I don't have any credentials. I don't have any money. What could I possibly contribute to an organization? You have something more valuable than credentials or money, Robertson said. You have courage. You have integrity. You have the ability to see what others miss because you move through the world in a way that makes you invisible to the people in power. That's an asset, a powerful asset. And you have something else too. You understand what's at stake because you're part of the communities being targeted. You're not some outside activist or well-meaning liberal who wants to help the poor people. You are the poor people. You know what it means to lose your home, to fight for every dollar, to be invisible and powerless. That perspective is invaluable. Margaret's mind was racing. An organization, a real organization dedicated to fighting corporate predators. It was a beautiful dream. But dreams required resources. How would this work? How would we fund it? I have money, Robertson said. A lot of money. 30 years of corporate bonuses and stock options. I always thought I was saving it for retirement. But what's the point of retiring rich if I've spent my whole life being morally bankrupt? I want to use that money for something good. We'll set up a nonprofit. We'll hire lawyers. We'll recruit people from inside corporations who are willing to leak information. We'll work with community organizers. We'll expose these projects before they can get off the ground. Why me? Margaret asked again. You could find someone with experience doing this kind of work. Because you already proved you can win, Robertson said. You took down the Riverside project with nothing but courage and intelligence. Imagine what you could do with actual resources behind you. With a team. With legal support. With funding. You could save dozens of communities. Hundreds, maybe. You could change the whole system. Margaret felt a spark of hope igniting in her chest. It was terrifying and exhilarating at the same time. I still have to work, she said. I have bills. I have my mother's care to pay for. I have my daughter's education. You'll be paid, Robertson said. A real salary. Better than what you're making now. You can quit this job. Work on this full-time. Or keep working here if you want to maintain your access to information. Whatever makes sense. Margaret thought about it. Thought about all the Riversides and Westbrooks in the country. All the communities being targeted by corporations that saw human beings as obstacles to profit. All the families who would lose their homes because nobody with power cared enough to stop it. Okay, she said finally. Let's do it. Let's build this organization. But I have some conditions. Name them, Robertson said. First, we save Westbrook, Margaret said. That's the immediate priority. We stop Meridian Development Group before they can destroy that community. That's our proof of concept. We show that this organization can actually work. Agreed, Robertson said. Second, we make sure the people in the communities we're trying to help have a voice in the organization, Margaret continued. This can't be outsiders swooping in to save the poor people. The people affected need to be part of the decision-making, part of the leadership. Absolutely, Robertson said. Third, you need to understand that I'm going to make mistakes, Margaret said. I've never run an organization. I don't know anything about nonprofits or fundraising or any of that stuff. You're going to have to teach me. And you're going to have to be patient. I'll be patient, Robertson promised. And I'll make mistakes too. I've spent my whole career working for the bad guys. I don't really know how to be one of the good guys yet. We'll figure it out together. They shook hands. It felt strange. A corporate executive and a janitor, partners in an impossible mission. But also right. Maybe even inevitable. Maybe this was what the Riverside confrontation had been building toward all along. Over the next 2 weeks, they met secretly several times. Always late at night. Always in empty offices or conference rooms. Robertson brought Margaret stacks of documents about Meridian Development Group. Financial records he had obtained through his network of contacts. Leaked memos. Evidence of fraud and corruption. Margaret absorbed it all, her quick mind cataloging information and identifying patterns. They researched Westbrook together, talked to community leaders there, explained what was coming and what they could do to fight back. At first, the people in Westbrook were skeptical. Why would a corporate executive and a janitor care about their neighborhood? What was the angle? What did they want in return? But Margaret knew how to talk to them. She spoke their language. She shared her own story, carefully edited to protect Richard Morrison's identity. She explained that she had stopped a similar project from destroying Riverside. She showed them that she was one of them. Not an outsider. Not a savior. just someone who had figured out how to fight back and wanted to share that knowledge. Slowly, the people of Westbrook began to trust them. Community leaders agreed to work with them. A local pastor offered his church as a meeting space. A teacher helped organize parents. A small business owner who ran a grocery store became their liaison to the immigrant community. Robert Chun used his corporate connections to identify which city officials were involved in the Meridian Project. Margaret used her network of janitors and cleaning staff to gather intelligence from inside the offices of those officials. Together, they built a case. They discovered that Meridian Development Group had bribed 3 city council members. They found evidence of falsified environmental reports. They uncovered the shell company structure that Meridian was using to hide its activities. And, most damning of all, they found evidence that Meridian had used the same strategy in 4 other cities, leaving behind contaminated land and destroyed communities. But evidence was not enough. They needed a way to bring this information to light in a way that would actually stop the project. They needed publicity. They needed pressure. They needed to make Meridian Development Group toxic to any politician or investor who tried to work with them. Robert Chin had an idea. He had a friend from business school who was now an investigative journalist at a major newspaper. A woman named Sarah Kim who had won awards for exposing corporate corruption. Robert Chin reached out to her, explained what they had discovered, and asked if she would be interested in the story. Sarah Kim was very interested. She met with them, reviewed their evidence, and agreed to write a series of articles exposing Meridian Development Group's practices. But she needed more than documents. She needed sources. People willing to go on record. Victims willing to share their stories. Margaret and Robert Chin went back to Westbrook. They talked to families who had received buyout offers. They interviewed small business owners who had been pressured to sell. They found people who had been displaced by Meridian projects in other cities and convinced them to share their experiences. The first article ran on a Sunday morning. The headline read, "Development or Destruction? How One Company Profits from Community Displacement." It featured families from Westbrook and 3 other cities. It included quotes from Margaret, identified only as a community advocate who helped expose the Riverside Project scandal. It included detailed evidence of bribery and corruption, and it included a response from Meridian Development Group that was carefully worded but essentially confirmed everything the article alleged. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Social media lit up. Local news stations picked up the story. Community activists from across the country reached out to share similar experiences with predatory development. City officials in Westbrook, exposed for taking bribes, scrambled to distance themselves from Meridian. The company's stock price dropped 15% in one day. By Tuesday, Meridian Development Group had announced they were suspending the Westbrook project pending a comprehensive review of community concerns. By Friday, they had canceled it entirely and fired the executives who had been involved. The bribed city officials resigned. Federal investigators opened a probe into Meridian's practices. Westbrook was saved, and Margaret and Robert Chin had proven that their model could work. That ordinary people with courage and resources could stand up to corporate power and win. The organization they founded was called the Community Defense Initiative. Robert Chin funded it with $2 million from his personal savings. They rented a small office in a building near Riverside. They hired a staff of 5, including a lawyer, 2 community organizers, and an investigative researcher. Margaret became the executive director, a title that felt absurd to her at first, but that she gradually grew into. She quit her job at Titanium Global. Her last night there, she cleaned the executive floor one final time. She stopped by Richard Morrison's office. He was working late, as usual. He looked up when she knocked on his door. "Margaret," he said, surprised. "What are you doing here? I heard you quit." "Last day," she said. "I wanted to say goodbye. And thank you." He stood up and walked around his desk. "I should be thanking you," he said. "What you did, what you've been doing, it's remarkable. I read about the Westbrook project. I know that was you." "It was me and a lot of other people," Margaret said. "That's the difference now. I'm not alone anymore." Richard Morrison smiled. It was a genuine smile. Warm. "You're going to change the world, aren't you?" 3 years after founding the Community Defense Initiative, Margaret stood in front of a congressional committee in Washington, D.C. She was wearing a suit that Robert Chin had insisted she buy for the occasion. It felt strange and uncomfortable. She kept tugging at the collar. But she was there, and she was going to speak, and people were going to listen. The hearing was about corporate accountability in urban development. Margaret had been invited to testify about the work her organization had done and about the patterns of predatory development they had documented across the country. Sitting next to her was Robert Chun, who would provide the financial and legal analysis. Behind them in the gallery were community leaders from 8 different cities that the Community Defense Initiative had helped save. Margaret's hands shook as she adjusted the microphone. She looked out at the committee members, at the cameras, at the reporters scribbling notes. 3 years ago, she had been invisible. Now she was testifying before Congress. Life was strange. "My name is Margaret Hayes," she began, her voice steady despite her nerves. 3 years ago, I was a janitor working the night shift at a major corporation in my city. I'm here today to tell you what I learned during those years, and what I've learned since, about how corporations systematically destroy low-income communities for profit while hiding behind legal structures that make them almost impossible to stop. She spoke for 20 minutes. She told them about the patterns she had observed. The shell companies, the bribed officials, the falsified reports, the tax shelters disguised as development projects. She showed them data her organization had compiled, charts and graphs demonstrating how the same strategies were being used in cities across America. She named names. She cited specific cases. She provided evidence. The committee members asked questions. Some were sympathetic. Some were hostile. One congressman, clearly friendly to corporate interests, tried to paint her as an anti-business radical who wanted to stop all development and kill jobs. Margaret handled them calmly. "I'm not against development, Congressman," she said. "I'm against predatory development that displaces families, destroys communities, and leaves contaminated land behind. Good development benefits everyone. It creates jobs for local residents. It improves infrastructure. It respects the people who already live in a community. What I'm describing is not development. It's extraction. These corporations extract value from communities and leave nothing behind but destruction." The hostile congressman sputtered and moved on to another line of questioning. Margaret answered every question directly and honestly. She did not dodge. She did not equivocate. She had learned over the past 3 years that the truth was her most powerful weapon. She just had to be brave enough to speak it. After the hearing, reporters surrounded her. Cameras flashed. Microphones were shoved in her face. She answered their questions patiently, even though all she wanted to do was go back to her hotel room and collapse. Robert Chun eventually rescued her, steering her through the crowd to a waiting car. "You were amazing," he said once they were safely inside. "Absolutely amazing. Do you know what you just did? You just put corporate predatory development on the national radar. This is going to change things." Margaret leaned her head back against the seat. "I hope so. God, I hope so. Because I'm exhausted, Robert. 3 years of fighting these battles. 3 years of never knowing if we have enough money to keep going. 3 years of threats and lawsuits and watching people lose their homes when we don't get there in time. I don't know how much longer I can do this." Robert Chin was quiet for a moment. "Do you want to quit?" Margaret thought about it. Did she? Part of her did. Part of her wanted to go back to a simple life. To being invisible. To not carrying the weight of so many communities on her shoulders. But another part of her knew she could never go back. She had seen too much. She knew too much. She had tasted victory, and she had experienced the crushing pain of defeats too. The communities they had failed to save haunted her. "No," she said finally. "I don't want to quit. I just want it to be easier. I want to stop feeling like we're always one lawsuit away from closing down. I want to stop worrying about money all the time. I want to be able to hire more staff so we can help more communities. I'm tired, but I'm not ready to quit." "Then, we need to find more sustainable funding," Robertson said. "My initial investment is running low. We need grants. We need major donors. We need to build an endowment that can keep us going for decades, not just years." Over the next 6 months, that became their focus. The congressional testimony had raised their profile significantly. Donations started coming in from small donors across the country. People who had read about their work. People who had been helped by them. People who just believed in the mission. It was not enough to sustain the organization long term, but it helped. Robertson reached out to foundations that funded social justice work. Margaret met with wealthy individuals who claimed to care about community development. Some of those meetings were encouraging. Others were frustrating. Margaret quickly learned that many rich people liked the idea of helping the poor more than they liked actually doing it. They wanted to fund projects that made them feel good, not organizations that challenged the systems that had made them rich. But, slowly, they built a funding base. A family foundation that had been created by a real estate developer who had made his fortune ethically gave them a substantial grant. A tech billionaire who had grown up in a neighborhood like Riverside became a major donor. A coalition of labor unions contributed funding in recognition of the Community Defense Initiative's work protecting working-class communities. With more stable funding, they were able to expand. They hired 10 more staff members. They opened satellite offices in 3 other cities. They created a legal defense fund to help them fight the lawsuits that corporations constantly filed against them. They developed a training program to teach community organizers in other cities how to identify and fight predatory development projects. Margaret's daughter Jessica graduated from university with a degree in civil engineering. She immediately joined the Community Defense Initiative, working on developing sustainable housing alternatives that communities could pursue instead of accepting predatory developments. Margaret was proud beyond words, though she tried not to show favoritism. Jessica was brilliant and passionate and brought fresh ideas to the organization. Margaret's mother passed away quietly in her sleep at the Morrison Family Health Center. She was 87 years old. She had lived to see her daughter become a nationally recognized advocate, though in her final years the dementia had been so advanced that she did not fully understand what Margaret was doing. At the funeral, Richard Morrison sent flowers and a note that simply said, "She would have been proud." Margaret wept when she read it. The work continued, year after year, victory after victory, but also defeats. Communities they could not save, projects they learned about too late, corporations that were too powerful or too well-connected to stop. Each defeat hurt. Each family displaced felt personal. Margaret learned to carry the weight of both success and failure. In the 5th year of the Community Defense Initiative's existence, they faced their biggest challenge yet. A massive development corporation called Atlantic Ventures was planning a project that would displace over 10,000 people across 3 connected neighborhoods in a major city. It was the largest predatory development scheme they had ever encountered. The project was worth over $2 billion. Atlantic Ventures had unlimited resources and had already secured support from the governor, the mayor, and most of the city council. The affected communities reached out to the Community Defense Initiative desperately. They had tried to fight on their own and had been crushed. They needed help. Real help. The kind of help that only an experienced organization with resources and expertise could provide. Margaret called an emergency staff meeting. They reviewed the evidence. The scope of the project was staggering. Atlantic Ventures had spent 3 years carefully preparing. They had bought politicians. They had planted favorable news stories. They had hired the best lawyers money could buy. They had learned from the failures of companies like Titanium Global and Meridian Development Group. They were smarter, more careful, more ruthless. "Can we beat them?" one of the staff members asked. Margaret looked around the room at her team. Young and old, black and white and brown, lawyers and organizers and researchers. People who had dedicated their lives to this work because they believed communities mattered more than profits. People who were exhausted and underpaid and facing an opponent that outmatched them in every measurable way. "I don't know," she said honestly. "This is bigger than anything we've ever faced. We might lose. We probably will lose. But we have to try. Because if we don't, who will? Those 10,000 people deserve to have someone fight for them. Even if we lose, we have to make sure they know they weren't forgotten. That someone cared." The staff voted unanimously to take on the case. They knew what they were risking. If they lost this fight, it could destroy the organization's credibility. It could drain their resources. It could set back their work by years. But they also knew they had no choice. This was what they had built the Community Defense Initiative to do, to fight impossible battles for people who had no one else. The campaign against Atlantic Ventures lasted 18 months. It was brutal. Margaret and her team worked 16-hour days. They filed lawsuits. They organized protests. They held community meetings. They reached out to journalists. They lobbied politicians. They did everything they could think of to slow down or stop the project. Atlantic Ventures fought back hard. They sued the Community Defense Initiative for defamation, tying up resources in legal battles. They planted negative stories about Margaret in friendly media outlets, calling her a radical who was destroying jobs and preventing economic development. They hired private investigators to dig into her past, looking for anything they could use against her. They contacted her daughter's employer and tried to get Jessica fired. They were vicious and relentless. There were nights when Margaret lay awake wondering if she had made a terrible mistake, if she should have stayed invisible, if trying to fight the system had been naive and foolish. There were days when the stress was so overwhelming that she considered just walking away from everything. But then, she would visit the neighborhoods that Atlantic Ventures was trying to destroy. She would meet the families. The elderly woman who had lived in the same house for 60 years. The young couple who had just bought their first home. The small business owner who had built his restaurant from nothing. Real people with real lives who deserved better than to be treated as obstacles to profit. And Margaret would remember why she was fighting. Not for glory, not for recognition, but because it was right. Because someone had to stand up for people who could not stand up for themselves. Because if she had learned anything from her years cleaning offices and observing the powerful, it was that they would never voluntarily limit their own greed. Someone had to force them to do the right thing. The turning point came from an unexpected source. A young lawyer working for Atlantic Ventures, named David Park, contacted the Community Defense Initiative secretly. He had evidence that Atlantic Ventures had committed fraud in securing environmental permits for the project. He had detailed documentation of bribes paid to state officials. He had emails proving that the company had lied about the scope and impact of the development. And he wanted to give it all to Margaret. Why? Margaret asked when they met in a coffee shop far from both their offices. Why are you doing this? You'll lose your job. You might face legal consequences. Why risk everything? David Park looked at her with tired eyes. Because I've spent 2 years working on this project, and I can't do it anymore. I can't sleep at night knowing what we're doing to those families. My own parents were immigrants. They struggled to buy a house in a neighborhood just like the ones we're destroying. If someone had done to them what we're doing to these people, it would have ruined their lives. I can't be part of that. I won't be. He handed her a thumb drive containing thousands of documents. This is everything. Use it. Stop this project. And please don't tell anyone where you got it until after the case is over. I need some time to find another job before this goes public. Margaret took the thumb drive. She looked at this young man who was sacrificing his career to do the right thing. She thought about how she had once been in a similar position. How walking into that conference room 5 years ago had seemed like professional suicide. How sometimes doing the right thing required risking everything. Thank you, she said. You're very brave. Braver than you probably realize. The evidence David Park provided was devastating. Margaret and her team worked with Sarah Kim, the journalist who had helped expose Meridian Development Group, to publish a series of articles revealing Atlantic Ventures' corruption. The articles ran in major newspapers across the country. They showed in detail how Atlantic Ventures had systematically bribed officials, falsified environmental reports, and misled investors about the true costs and impacts of the project. The reaction was swift. Federal prosecutors opened a criminal investigation. The governor and mayor who had supported the project suddenly distanced themselves from it. Investors started pulling out. Atlantic Ventures' stock price collapsed. Within 3 months, the company had canceled the project and announced they were ceasing all development activities pending a complete restructuring of their business practices. 10,000 people kept their homes. 3 vibrant neighborhoods remained intact, and the Community Defense Initiative had won its biggest victory yet. But the victory came at a cost. The legal battles had drained most of their resources. Several staff members had quit under the stress. Margaret herself had developed stress-related health problems that required medication. In the aftermath of the Atlantic Ventures victory, Margaret took a month off for the first time in 5 years. She went to visit her daughter, who had moved to another city to work on affordable housing projects. They spent long evenings talking about everything that had happened, about the victories and the defeats, about the cost of fighting for justice, about whether it was all worth it. "I'm proud of you, Mom," Jessica said one night. "I know this work has been hard on you. I know you've sacrificed a lot. But you've changed so many lives. You've proven that ordinary people can fight back against powerful corporations and win. That matters. It matters so much. Margaret smiled. I just hope it lasts. That's my biggest fear, that all this work will be temporary. That 10 years from now, corporations will find new ways to do the same things. And all our victories will mean nothing. Then, we keep fighting, Jessica said. We teach the next generation to fight. We build systems and organizations that outlast us. We make sure that what you started continues long after you're gone. That's how we make change permanent. When Margaret returned to work after her month off, she felt renewed. Tired still, but 7 years after Margaret Hayes walked into that conference room and said 4 words that changed her life, she stood on a stage at a community center in Riverside accepting an award. The National Community Development Association was honoring her with their Lifetime Achievement Award for her work protecting vulnerable neighborhoods from predatory development. The room was packed with community leaders, activists, journalists, and even a few corporate executives who had learned to respect the work she did. Margaret looked out at the audience and felt overwhelmed. Not by pride, though she felt that too, but by the weight of everything that had happened to bring her to this moment. All the battles fought, all the communities saved, all the families who still had homes because she had found the courage to speak up when it would have been easier and safer to stay silent. Robert Chin was in the front row, beaming with pride. Next to him sat Jessica, now a successful housing policy advocate in her own right. Sarah Kim, the journalist, was there with a camera crew documenting the event. And in the back of the room, almost hidden in the shadows, was Richard Morrison. He had aged in the 7 years since Margaret had last seen him. His hair was completely white now, but he was smiling. When their eyes met, he nodded. A gesture of respect between two people who had changed each other's lives in ways neither had expected. Margaret stepped up to the microphone. The room fell silent. She had prepared a speech, but, looking out at all these faces, she decided to speak from her heart instead. 7 years ago, she began, I was invisible. I pushed a cleaning cart through corporate offices. I mopped floors and emptied trash cans and cleaned bathrooms. I was so invisible that people had full conversations about destroying communities while I was standing right there in the room with them. They never thought I was listening. They never imagined I would understand. And they certainly never imagined I would do anything about what I heard. She paused, letting the words sink in. But I did do something. Because I realized that being invisible gave me power. I could see things that others missed. I could hear secrets that were never meant for my ears. And I could use that information to fight back. Not for myself, for my community, for my neighbors, for my mother and my daughter and all the people who had no voice and no power. The audience was completely still, listening. That first night, when I walked into that conference room and told a CEO to hold off on signing a contract, I was terrified. I was certain I would be fired, maybe arrested, definitely ruined. But I did it anyway because I had to. Because sometimes you reach a point where doing nothing is worse than risking everything. And I got lucky. I found leverage. I found a way to win. But that was just the beginning. Margaret looked at Robert Chun. I also found allies. People who were tired of being part of the problem and wanted to be part of the solution. People who were willing to use their resources and their expertise to help communities fight back. And together, we built something that has saved dozens of neighborhoods from destruction. We've kept thousands of families in their homes. We've exposed corruption and fraud. We've changed laws and policies. We've shown that ordinary people can win against extraordinary power if they have courage and support. She gestured to the audience. But I'm not the hero of this story. You are. Every community organizer who spent nights knocking on doors and organizing meetings. Every lawyer who worked pro bono to fight corporations in court. Every journalist who investigated and exposed wrongdoing. Every whistleblower who risked their career to do the right thing. Every family that stood up and refused to be pushed out of their homes. You are the heroes. I just helped coordinate the fight. Margaret paused, gathering her thoughts. I want to tell you what I've learned in these 7 years. I've learned that the system is designed to keep certain people powerless and invisible. Poor people, working people, people of color, immigrants, the elderly, the vulnerable. The system wants us to believe that we don't matter, that we can't change anything. that we should just accept whatever happens to us because we don't have the money or the connections or the education to fight back. Her voice grew stronger. But that's a lie. The biggest lie ever told. Because the truth is, we have more power than we realize. Not the power that comes from money or position. Real power. The power that comes from standing together. From refusing to be silent. From refusing to be invisible. From refusing to accept injustice just because fighting it is hard. She looked directly at the cameras, knowing her words would be broadcast and shared. If you're watching this, and you're facing something similar in your community, listen to me. You are not powerless. You are not alone. You can fight back. You can win. It won't be easy. It will probably be the hardest thing you've ever done. But it's possible. We've proven it's possible. Margaret's voice softened. I also want to say something to the people in power. The CEOs and investors and politicians who make decisions that affect communities. You need to understand that we see you. We hear you. We know what you're planning, even when you think we're too ignorant or too powerless to understand. And we will fight you. We will expose you. We will make it impossible for you to profit from destroying communities. So you have a choice. You can do the right thing voluntarily, or we will force you to do it. But either way, the era of unchallenged corporate predation is over. She smiled. Now, I know some of you in this room work for corporations. Some of you are executives. Some of you have made choices in your careers that you're not proud of. I'm not here to judge you. I'm here to invite you to join us. It's never too late to choose a different path, to use your power and your resources and your knowledge for good instead of profit. Some of the most valuable allies we've had were people who used to work on the other side. People who got tired of being the villain and wanted to be the hero. The door is always open. Margaret looked at her award, a heavy glass sculpture shaped like a house. This award has my name on it, but it belongs to everyone who has fought alongside me. It belongs to the people of Riverside who trusted me to protect their community. It belongs to the families in Westbrook and in dozens of other neighborhoods who stood up and refused to be displaced. It belongs to Robert Chun, who gave up a lucrative career to fund our organization. It belongs to Sarah Kim, who has exposed corruption again and again. It belongs to every single person who chose to fight instead of surrender. She held the award up. And, most of all, it belongs to my mother, who taught me that dignity matters more than money, who showed me that you can be poor and still be proud, who raised me to believe that I had just as much right to take up space in the world as anyone else. She didn't live to see this moment, but she made it possible. Everything good I've ever done, I learned from her. Margaret set the award down and gripped the podium. In closing, I want to share my vision for the future. The Community Defense Initiative is not just about stopping bad developments. It's about creating alternatives. We're working with architects and engineers and urban planners to design development projects that actually serve communities instead of destroying them. Projects that create affordable housing and good jobs and public spaces. Projects that respect the people who already live in a neighborhood instead of pushing them out. Projects that prove you don't have to choose between economic development and social justice. You can have both. She looked at Jessica. My daughter is leading this work. She represents the next generation of activists and advocates who will take what we've started and make it even better. Who will solve problems we haven't figured out yet. Who will build a world where predatory development is not just illegal, but unthinkable. That's my hope. That's my dream. That's what I'm working toward every single day. Margaret took a deep breath. So thank you for this award. Thank you for your support. Thank you for believing that change is possible. And thank you for fighting alongside us. The work continues. The battle continues. But we're winning. Slowly, painfully, one community at a time, we're winning. And we won't stop until every family in this country has a safe, affordable place to call home. Until every community is protected from predatory practices. Until the system that allows corporations to profit from human suffering is dismantled and replaced with something better. Something just. Something humane. She stepped back from the microphone. The audience erupted in applause. People stood. The ovation went on for several minutes. Margaret stood on the stage, fighting back tears, overwhelmed by the love and support in the room. After the ceremony, there was a reception. Margaret found herself surrounded by people wanting to talk to her. Community leaders asking for advice. young activists seeking mentorship, journalists requesting interviews. She tried to give everyone a moment, tried to make everyone feel heard and valued, even though she was exhausted. Richard Morrison approached her when the crowd had thinned a bit. They stood facing each other, these two people who had started as adversaries and had somehow become something else. Not quite friends, but perhaps something deeper. Allies in an unlikely partnership. That was quite a speech, he said. Did you mean what you said about the door always being open? He asked. About people changing sides? Margaret studied his face. Yes. Want? Because I want to help, he said. Really help. Not just donations. I want to use what I know about how corporations operate to teach communities how to fight back. I want to consult with your organization, show you the playbook from the inside, help you anticipate what these companies will do before they do it. Margaret was surprised. What about Titanium Global? What about your career? I'm retiring, Richard Morrison said. Next month. I've spent 40 years building wealth and power. I want to spend whatever time I have left doing something that matters. Something good. You showed me that was possible. That night 7 years ago, you gave me a chance to make a different choice. I took it then, with Riverside. I want to take it again now. Let me help you. Margaret extended her hand. Welcome to the team, Richard. They shook hands. And Margaret felt a sense of completion. A circle closing. The man who had almost destroyed Riverside was now going to help protect other communities. People could change. Systems could change. It just required courage and persistence and the willingness to believe that tomorrow could be better than today. Later that evening, after the reception had ended and most people had gone home, Margaret sat with Robert Chun and Jessica and Sarah Kim in a quiet corner of the community center. They were tired but happy, talking about the event, about the future, about all the work that still needed to be done. Do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't walked into that conference room? Robert Chun asked. If you had just stayed silent? Margaret considered the question. All the time. Riverside would have been destroyed. Thousands of people would have lost their homes. And I would have spent the rest of my life regretting that I didn't even try to stop it. I think about the person I used to be. The invisible janitor who kept her head down and never made waves. And I barely recognize her. That woman was so afraid. So convinced that she didn't matter. So certain that she had no power. What changed? Jessica asked. What made you decide to speak up? I realized that I had a choice, Margaret said. That's what it came down to. I could choose to stay invisible and safe. Or I could choose to be seen and take a risk. And once I understood it was a choice, the decision became easy. Because how could I live with myself if I chose safety over doing what was right? How could I look my mother in the eye? How could I look you in the eye? She put her hand on Jessica's shoulder. How could I teach you to be brave if I was a coward? Sarah Kim leaned forward. Can I ask you something I've always wondered? That first night, when you walked into the conference room, did you have a plan? Did you know what you were going to say? Margaret laughed. Not at all. I was making it up as I went along. I had no idea what I was doing. I just knew I couldn't let them sign that contract. Everything else I figured out in the moment. Which was terrifying, by the way. I don't recommend confronting powerful people without a plan. But sometimes you don't have time for a plan. Sometimes you just have to act and hope it works out. It worked out, Robert Chun said. It worked out, Margaret agreed. But it almost didn't. So many times it almost didn't. That's what people don't understand about social justice work. We celebrate the victories, but we don't talk enough about how close we come to losing. How many times we've been one break, one piece of evidence, one brave whistleblower away from total defeat. We've been lucky. Lucky to have the right people in the right places at the right times. Lucky that our opponents made mistakes. Lucky that we were smart enough and fast enough to capitalize on those mistakes. It's not just luck, Jessica said. You're being too modest. You built this organization. You created a model that works. You inspired people to join the fight. That's not luck. That's leadership. Margaret smiled at her daughter. Maybe. But I'm also just a woman who used to clean offices and got tired of watching bad people do bad things. That's all. I'm not special. I'm not a genius. I'm just someone who decided that enough was enough and did something about it. And that's my message to everyone. You don't have to be special to make a difference. You just have to care enough to try. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment. Then, Robert Chun raised his glass of water. A toast. To Margaret Hayes. The woman who proved that the most powerful person in the room is sometimes the one everyone refuses to see. The woman who showed us all what courage looks like. The woman who changed the world by refusing to stay invisible. They clinked glasses. Margaret felt tears in her eyes again. Happy tears this time. Grateful tears. She had come so far from that night 7 years ago. From being a scared janitor to being a nationally recognized advocate. From having no voice to speaking before Congress. From being invisible to being seen. But the journey was not over. There were still communities to protect. Still corporations to fight. Still families who needed help. The work would continue. The Community Defense Initiative would continue. With or without her, it would continue. Because she had built something bigger than herself. Something sustainable. Something permanent. As they left the community center that night, Margaret looked up at the riverside neighborhood around her. The houses were lit up. Families were inside, safe and secure. Children played in yards. Small businesses were still open, serving their communities. Everything was as it should be. Because she had found the courage to speak up. Because she had refused to stay invisible. Margaret thought about all the other riversides out there. All the communities facing threats. All the families who needed someone to fight for them. And she felt not overwhelmed, but determined. There was work to do. Important work. Hard work. But necessary work. And she was ready. 10 years after that night in the conference room, Margaret Hayes published a book. It was titled From Invisible to Invincible: How Ordinary People Can Fight Corporate Power. The book told her story but also provided practical guidance for community organizing. How to identify predatory development projects. How to build coalitions. How to work with lawyers and journalists. How to find leverage against powerful corporations. How to sustain a long-term fight. The book became a bestseller. It was read by community activists across the country and around the world. It was taught in university courses on social movements and urban planning. It inspired a new generation of organizers to believe that they could make a difference. But, more importantly, it worked. Communities that read the book and followed its guidance successfully stopped predatory developments in their neighborhoods. The model Margaret had created was being replicated everywhere. The Community Defense Initiative had chapters in over 100 cities. Similar organizations were springing up internationally. The system was changing. Slowly, but changing. Some corporations were actually starting to engage in good faith development that benefited communities rather than destroying them. Some politicians were passing stronger protections for vulnerable neighborhoods. Some lawyers were specializing in community defense work. The culture was shifting. And it had all started because one woman who cleaned offices for a living decided that she mattered. That her community mattered. That the people who were supposed to be invisible actually had the power to change the world. Margaret Hayes was 60 years old now. Her hair was gray. Her back still ached from all those years of mopping floors. But she was happy. Truly, deeply happy. She had found her purpose. She had made a difference. She had proven that ordinary people could do extraordinary things if they had the courage to try. She still lived in Riverside, in the same modest house she had lived in for decades. She could afford something nicer now. The book royalties and speaking fees had made her financially comfortable for the first time in her life. But she stayed in Riverside because it was home, because it reminded her of why she fought, because the people there knew her not as a famous activist, but as Margaret, just Margaret, the woman who used to clean offices, the woman who saved their neighborhood, the woman who proved that anyone could be a hero. On the 10th anniversary of the founding of the Community Defense Initiative, they held a celebration in Riverside. Thousands of people attended. Community leaders from across the country. Families who had been saved from displacement. Young activists who had been inspired by Margaret's work. Even some corporate executives who had learned to respect what she had built. Margaret stood on the stage, looking out at the crowd, and felt a profound sense of gratitude. For the journey. For the people who had helped her. For the communities she had served. For the opportunity to make a difference. Thank you, she said simply. Thank you for believing that change was possible. Thank you for fighting alongside me. Thank you for proving that ordinary people can do extraordinary things. The work continues. The battle continues. But look how far we've come. Look at what we've built together. This is just the beginning. The crowd cheered. And Margaret Hayes, who had once been invisible, stood in the light and smiled. Because she had learned the greatest lesson of all. That everyone matters. That everyone has power. that everyone can be a hero. You just have to find the courage to step out of the shadows and into the fight. And sometimes, all it takes is 4 words. Hold off on that contract. For words that changed everything. For words that saved a community. For words that started a movement. For words spoken by a woman who refused to stay invisible. A woman who proved that the most powerful thing any of us can do is stand up and speak our truth, no matter how scared we are, no matter how impossible the odds seem. Because in the end, courage is contagious. Justice is possible. And change begins with one person deciding that enough is enough and doing something about it. Even if that person is just a janitor with a mop and a bucket and a heart full of determination. Especially if that person is just a janitor with a mop and a bucket and a heart full of determination. Inud, she called a staff meeting and announced a new initiative. They were going to create a national network of community defense initiative chapters. They were going to train local leaders in cities across the country to identify and fight predatory development in their own communities. They were going to build something that could survive without her. Something permanent. It was ambitious. Maybe too ambitious. But Margaret had learned that nothing worth doing was ever easy. That real change required sustained effort over years and decades. That one person could start a movement, but it took many people to make it last. Over the next 2 years, they established community defense initiative chapters in 15 cities. They created detailed training materials. They developed a network of lawyers and journalists and community organizers who could support local efforts. They set up a rapid response system so that communities facing predatory development could get help quickly. The work continued, and it would continue long after Margaret Hayes, because she had learned the most important lesson of all. That power did not come from being invisible. It came from refusing to stay invisible, from standing up, from speaking out, from fighting back even when the odds seemed impossible, and from teaching others to do the same. "I'm going to try," Margaret said. They shook hands. And then, Margaret left Titanium Global for the last time. She walked out of the building without looking back. She had spent 11 years being invisible in those halls. Now she was stepping into the light, into a new life, into a mission that terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. The Community Defense Initiative began to grow. Word spread. Other communities facing displacement reached out for help. Whistleblowers from inside corporations contacted them with information. Lawyers volunteered their time. Journalists asked to partner with them on investigations. Within a year, they had stopped 3 more predatory development projects. They had helped communities organize to fight back against corporate intimidation. They had exposed corruption in city governments across 5 states. They had become a legitimate force that corporations actually feared. But success brought new challenges. Margaret quickly discovered that running an organization was far more complicated than confronting a single CEO. There were budget decisions, personnel issues, strategic disagreements, fundraising pressures, legal threats from the corporations they were fighting. There were times when Margaret missed the simplicity of her old life. When she missed the quiet nights pushing a cleaning cart through empty halls. When she missed being invisible and unnoticed and safe. Running an organization meant being visible, being a target, having her name in newspapers, and her face on websites. It meant receiving threatening phone calls and hate mail and lawsuits. But every time she felt overwhelmed, every time she wanted to quit, she thought about Riverside, about Westbrook, about all the communities they had saved and all the families who still had homes because of their work. And she kept going. "What happened?" Destiny asked. "I can't tell you the details," Margaret said. "But I can tell you this. Never underestimate yourself. Never let anyone make you feel like you don't matter. You matter. Your voice matters. Your actions matter. Sometimes the people who change the world are the ones nobody sees coming." Destiny nodded slowly, not fully understanding but sensing that Margaret was sharing something important. They continued the training, moving from office to office, Margaret teaching Destiny the invisible rhythms of their invisible work. And, in Richard Morrison's office, on his desk, the photograph of the Morrison Family Health Center remained, a silent testament to the night when a janitor walked into a room full of powerful people and changed everything. "I told you," Margaret said. "I've been here for 11 years. I see everything. I hear everything. And I remember everything. You want to destroy Riverside? Fine. But I'll destroy you first. I'll send those account numbers to the IRS. I'll send them to your wife's lawyers. I'll send them to every news outlet in the country. You'll go to prison, Mr. Morrison. Tax evasion. Fraud. All of it. Is the Riverside project worth that? They stood facing each other in the empty conference room. Outside the windows, the city lights stretched to the horizon. Inside, two people from completely different worlds were locked in a battle that neither had expected. Richard Morrison was breathing hard, calculating, trying to figure out his next move. Finally, he spoke. What do you want? He asked. Really, what do you want? Margaret had won. She could hardly believe it, but she had won. Now she just had to be smart enough not to lose everything in the next 5 minutes.